Two British cars left a Longbridge assembly line in 1969. One won a design award that same year. The other became a punchline that followed it into the next decade, mocked for its face, ignored for what sat underneath the metal. Only one of those two cars was still selling in showrooms 10 years later. It wasn't the one that won anything. This is the story of the Austin Maxi, the hatchback Britain laughed at first and needed most. Stick around, because the thing people ridiculed is the same reason every hatchback built since copied its shape. Tell me below, which classic underdog deserves a second look? Longbridge in early 1968 ran 3 shifts a day, and none of them were building anything like this before. Workers on the trim line had spent a decade bolting doors onto saloons that all followed the same formula: a boot, a hinge, a shape everyone already understood. The car taking form on this particular line broke that formula in a way nobody at British Motor Corporation had attempted at this scale. 5 doors. Not 4. A hatch at the back instead of a separate boot lid, hinged to lift the entire rear glass and let the whole cargo area open at once. Renault had tried something similar on a smaller car years earlier, and a handful of Continental engineers had experimented with the format. Nobody had put it on a mainstream family car built for a British production line, in British volumes, sold to British buyers who'd never asked for one. Alec Isagonis had already reshaped the industry once, with the Mini. Here, working alongside engineer Charles Griffin, he pushed for something more ambitious than a facelift or a badge swap. The Maxi needed to solve a problem most family cars ignored entirely. What happens to the inside of a car once the driving is done and the living begins? Fold the rear seats flat, and the Maxi became something closer to a small van than a saloon, with a load space long enough to sleep in a pinch. Push the front seats back too, and the whole cabin turned into something close to a double bed, an option early brochures actually illustrated without a hint of embarrassment. Families camping on a budget noticed. Delivery drivers noticed. Nobody else in Austin's lineup offered anything close. Underneath the body sat something just as unusual. Hydrolastic suspension linked the front and rear wheels on each side through fluid-filled units, letting the car absorb a bump at the front and pass some of that motion smoothly to the rear instead of jolting the cabin twice over the same pothole. It rode softer than anything else Austin built. It also cost more to engineer than a simple set of springs, and every engineer on the project understood exactly what that cost was buying. Picture the interior team walking through a mock-up cabin in late 1967, checking hinge points, measuring how far a folded seat back needed to sit before it cleared the wheel arch. Every centimeter mattered. A hatchback door that size demanded a stiffer body shell than a standard saloon, since removing a solid boot lid took away structure the rest of the car normally relied on. Reinforcing that shell added weight. Weight ate into performance. Performance mattered to a company that still needed this car to outrun its own reputation for building sensible, forgettable transport. Somewhere in that trade-off, a decision got made that would follow the Maxi out of the factory and straight into showrooms. BMC's engineering budget had already been stretched thin by other projects moving through Longbridge at the same time, and the transmission chosen for the Maxi's launch used a cable-operated gear change instead of the more common rod linkage most rivals relied on. Cables were cheaper, cables were lighter, cables, on paper, worked exactly the way the engineers intended. On paper. That distinction would matter more than anyone signing off on the decision realized at the time. Every other piece of the car had been tested, argued over, and refined by people who clearly understood what they were building. The seats folded exactly as promised. The hatch opened wide enough to swallow a week's shopping or a bicycle with the front wheel still attached. The ride soaked up broken tarmac in a way saloon buyers had never experienced from a family car at this price. Nobody walking the factory floor in early 1969 was thinking about the gear change. They were thinking about a car that did something genuinely new, built by a company finally willing to gamble on it. That gamble was about to meet its first real test, on roads far rougher than anything inside a factory mock-up, in the hands of ordinary drivers who had no patience for a car that couldn't find its own gears. Rain hit the M1 outside Rugby on a Tuesday morning in March 1969, and a Maxi owner named Nobody Remembers Today sat stranded on the hard shoulder, unable to find third gear. He wasn't alone. Dealers across the country were fielding the same complaint within weeks of launch, and the problem wasn't the engine, the suspension, or anything the design team had spent months perfecting. It was the cable. That lightweight cable-operated gear change, chosen to save weight and cost, stretched under everyday use, in a way the bench tests back at Longbridge had never fully predicted. Gears that should have snapped into place instead hunted around a vague, rubbery gap between ratios. Drivers used to a firm, mechanical click found themselves stirring a loose lever and hoping. Some got it right, plenty didn't, and stalled at junctions in front of queuing traffic that had no idea why the odd-looking five-door car ahead of them wouldn't move. Road testers noticed immediately, and they weren't kind about it. Reviews that praised the interior space and the ride quality in one paragraph turned sharp in the next, singling out a gear change one testing publication called "Vague Enough to Embarrass a Car Built Around Genuinely Clever Engineering." That contrast stung more than a simple bad review would have. Here was a car doing something nobody else in Britain had tried, undone in the public's mind by the one part that should have been the simplest to get right. Word spread the way it always does among people who talk about cars for a living. Comedians on regional radio found an easy target. Competing dealers, selling saloons with a boot lid and nothing more adventurous under the bonnet, pointed customers toward the Maxi's queue-stalling reputation before customers even asked. A car engineered to be years ahead of its rivals was being remembered, in its first year on sale, for the one component that felt years behind them. Early buyers split into two camps fast. Some traded the car in within months, unwilling to fight a gear lever every time traffic slowed near a roundabout. Others adapted, learning the specific half-second pause the cable needed before a shift would properly engage, treating it less like a flaw and more like a quirk they'd made peace with. Neither group was entirely wrong about what they were driving. If you've ever owned a car with one maddening flaw buried inside an otherwise brilliant design, you already know exactly what these early Maxi owners were living with. And if stories like this keep you curious about the cars everyone else forgot, hitting subscribe means you won't miss the next one. Inside Longbridge, engineers who'd fought hard for the Maxi's more ambitious features watched the complaints pile up with a specific kind of frustration. They hadn't cut a corner on the hatch, the seats, or the suspension. They'd cut it on the one part connecting the driver's hand to everything else the car could do, and that single decision was now defining the whole car in showrooms up and down the country. Fixing it wasn't simple. A cable-operated system couldn't just be tightened or adjusted its way out of the complaint. The geometry itself needed rethinking, and rethinking a transmission mid-production meant retooling, retesting, and admitting publicly that the launch version hadn't been good enough. British Motor Corporation, already merging into the larger and increasingly strained British Leyland during this exact period, had every reason to quietly shelve the problem and hope it faded. Nobody shelved it. Somewhere inside Longbridge's engineering department, a rod-linkage gear change was already being drawn up to replace the cable entirely, alongside a new engine that would need a specific kind of transmission to match it properly. Neither project moved fast. Both moved with a seriousness that suggested somebody inside the company still believed this car deserved a second chance. That second chance arrived faster than the skeptics expected, and it changed everything about how the Maxi would be remembered for the rest of its production run. October 1970 brought the fix, and it arrived faster than anyone outside Longbridge expected. The Maxi's second iteration swapped the troublesome cable gear change for a proper rod linkage, paired it with a new 1750cc E-Series engine, and gave drivers something the launch car never had, a shift that clicked into place exactly where they expected it to be. Journalists who'd mocked the original gear change drove the revised version and said so plainly. One review that had called the launch car's transmission an embarrassment now described the same fundamental car as genuinely transformed, praising a shift action that finally matched the ambition sitting everywhere else under the skin. Readers who dismissed the Maxi in 1969 started reconsidering it in 1971, and dealers noticed the shift in tone before the sales figures caught up to confirm it. Buyers who'd waited on the sidelines curious about the space and the folding seats but scared off by the gearbox horror stories, started walking back into showrooms. Company reps, drawn by the sheer practicality of a 5-door family car that could swallow a week's luggage or a set of golf clubs without complaint, became some of the Maxi's most loyal customers through the early 1970s. Delivery firms bought them in bulk. Large families needed them for a different reason. Nothing else at the price offered a flat load floor stretching from the back seats to the tailgate. Sales climbed steadily, not spectacularly, through the middle years of the decade. The kind of quiet, consistent number that rarely makes headlines, but keeps a factory line running year after year. British Leyland kept the Maxi in production for 12 years total, a run longer than most of its saloon rivals managed. Built almost entirely on a reputation the car had to fight hard to earn back after its own launch nearly buried it. Company fleets valued something rival saloons couldn't match: 5 real doors, a genuinely flat load area, and running costs that stayed low enough to keep accountants happy long after the initial purchase. A Maxi could carry passengers on Monday and a full set of sales samples on Tuesday, and plenty of small businesses across Britain built their delivery routines around exactly that flexibility. Nobody wrote glowing magazine features about a car doing its job reliably for a decade. Reliable, unglamorous work rarely earns headlines, even when it's exactly what keeps a model alive. Consider what that longevity actually proved. Rivals launched with cleaner reputations and smoother debuts, yet several of them vanished from showrooms years before the Maxi finally did in 1981. A car mocked at launch for one bad component had outlasted competitors that never gave critics a single thing to complain about. Something about the underlying idea, the hatchback layout, the folding cabin, the practical bones British buyers kept returning to, mattered more in the long run than a rocky first impression ever could. Here's the number that tells the real story. Over 400,000 Maxis left British factories across its full production run, a figure that dwarfs what a genuine failure could have ever managed. Cars that truly disappoint buyers get quietly discontinued within a few short years, not kept in production, and gradually refined across more than a decade. Longbridge kept building it because customers, once they got past that first rocky year, kept choosing it over saloons that offered less for the same money. By the late 1970s, the joke that had followed the Maxi out of the factory in 1969 had mostly faded from memory, replaced by a quieter kind of respect among the people who actually drove one daily. Reps who'd once dreaded being handed the keys to a Maxi instead requested them, knowing exactly how much easier a 5-door hatchback made loading samples after a long day on the road. Families who'd bought one reluctantly, talked into it by a patient dealer, found themselves recommending it to neighbors shopping for their next car. The Maxi never became fashionable. It never won back the design award attention that had gone to its flashier 1969 rival on the very same factory floor. What it earned instead was something rarer for a car that started life as a punchline, over a decade of steady, unglamorous loyalty from the exact buyers who mattered most, won entirely on its own terms, inside its own lifetime, without needing history to vindicate it later. 2 cars left that Longbridge floor in 1969. One took home a design award and quietly disappeared within the decade. The other got mocked, fixed, and outsold it for 12 more years. Which one do you actually remember? Tell me below, and follow for the next car everyone got wrong.